Commander Lisa Grant stood by the large window of the space station and looked at the stars above. Earth, but something was wrong because the stars were getting darker and it was not natural. Darkness, but something else was covering them like a shadow moving across the galaxy, and she felt cold fear in her chest when she thought about what was happening out there in Space 30. 7 human colonies had gone silent in the last 6 months, and nobody knew what happened to them, because when the rescue ships arrived, they found empty cities and abandoned homes, but no bodies and no signs of fighting. Just silence everywhere. Like everyone had vanished into thin air, and the military was getting more worried with each passing day. Elisa turned away from the window and walked to the communication center where her team was monitoring signals from across human space, and Lieutenant Kate Morgan was sitting at her station looking at screens full of data, and Kate was young but very smart, and she had been studying every report about the missing colonies, trying to find some pattern. Kate looked up when Lisa approached, and her face was pale because she had just received new information, and she said that another colony had stopped responding, and it was New Gardens, which was home to 3 million people, and Lisa felt her stomach twist because that was where her sister lived with her family. The enemy had finally shown themselves 3 weeks ago, and what humanity discovered changed everything they knew about the universe, because they were not machines or aliens like in the old stories, but something much stranger and more terrifying, and they were elves, which sounded like something from fairy tales, but these elves were real and deadly. They came from another dimension entirely, and they moved through space like water flowing around rocks, and their ships were beautiful but frightening at the same time. And they were led by a woman whose name was Sarith, and people called her the Shadow Weaver because shadows seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sarith commanded armies that appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly, and her forces attacked human colonies with precision and purpose, but nobody understood why, because the elves never tried to communicate or make demands, and they just destroyed everything human and then left. But the worst thing about Sarith was her dragon, and it was massive beyond anything humanity had ever seen. And its scales were black like the void of space, and they absorbed all light, so when it flew through space, it looked like a hole in reality itself. And scouts who survived encounters with it spoke of violet flames that could destroy entire ships in seconds. The dragon had intelligence too, and people could see it in those burning eyes that watched humanity like we were insects beneath notice. And some survivors said they heard voices in their minds when the dragon was near, and the voices drove some crew members insane with fear. Lieutenant Kate Morgan had been watching recordings of the attacks over and over until she knew every movement by heart, and there was something strange about how Sarith fought, because she did not just destroy colonies randomly but seemed to be searching for something specific, and Kate could see it in the way the elf forces scoured each world. Before living, Kate called Lisa over to her station and showed her the pattern she had discovered, and she pointed to a map of human space where red dots marked the attacked colonies, and when you looked at them all together, you could see they formed a line moving toward Earth, and whatever Sarith was searching for, she was getting closer to finding it. Dr. Helen Price was an archaeologist who studied ancient ruins on Mars and other planets, and she had been working on old human sites when the attack started, and at first she thought her work had nothing to do with the war, but then she noticed something that made her hands shake with fear. Every single colony that Sarith attacked had ancient ruins on it, and these were places where the oldest human ancestors had left strange markings thousands of years ago, and Helen had studied some of these markings, and she always thought they were interesting, but now she realized they might be the key to understanding why the elves were attacking. Helen requested an emergency meeting with the military council, and when she stood before all those important commanders and politicians, she felt very small, but she knew her information was vital. So she took a deep breath and began explaining what she had discovered. She showed them images of the ancient markings from different colonies, and then she showed them symbols from dimensional rift studies that scientists had been working on, and the symbols matched perfectly, which meant that ancient humans, or something else, had been working with dimensional technology thousands of years ago. The council members looked at each other with growing concern, and one general asked Helen what this meant, and she said that the elves were not invading human space, but reclaiming it because these worlds belonged to them.
I language for humans.
arrived and we had disturbed something they left behind. Commander? Lisa Grant felt ice settle in her chest, and she asked the question everyone was thinking. And she said, "What exactly did humanity disturb?" And Helen looked down at her hands and the voice was barely above a whisper. When she answered, she said she did not know what it was, but whatever humanity had found or awakened, it was something the elves desperately wanted back, and Sirith was willing to kill every human in the galaxy too. Retrieve it, and the room fell silent as everyone processed this terrible news. War suddenly made sense, but that only made it more frightening, because humanity was not fighting over territory or resources, but fighting for the right to exist. And they were caught in the middle of something far older and darker than anyone could understand. Kate spoke up from her station and said that new dimensional readings were appearing near. Jupiter and the patterns matched previous elf attacks, and everyone in the command center froze because they all knew what this meant. And Sirith was coming to Earth, and she was bringing her entire... Lisa looked around at her team and saw fear in their eyes, but also determination, because humans had always been fighters, and even when facing impossible odds, they never gave up without a struggle. And she knew that the coming battle would decide the fate of their entire species. The defense fleet began moving into position around Earth, and every ship humanity could spare was being called back from patrol routes and mining operations, and it was not a large fleet compared to what Sirith commanded. But it was all they had. Civilian evacuation ships were being loaded with people from Earth and the Moon and other orbital stations, but there was not enough time to evacuate everyone, and millions would have to stay and hope that the military could protect them. Helen continued her research, frantically trying to understand what the ancient markings meant, and she found references to something sealed away and something imprisoned, but the markings were incomplete, and she could not figure out what exactly was hidden. Kate worked with the tactical team to analyze Sirith's previous attacks, looking for any weakness they could exploit, but the elf woman seemed to anticipate every human strategy, and her dragon made conventional weapons almost useless. Stood at the window again, watching the defense fleet assemble, and she thought about her sister on New Gardens and hoped that somehow she had escaped before the colony fell, and she thought about all the other families being torn apart by this war. The dimensional readings grew stronger, and space itself began to ripple near Jupiter like heat waves on a summer day, and then the rifts opened and Spherius' fleet began pouring through, and there were thousands of ships, each one graceful and deadly. The dragon emerged first, and even from millions of kilometers away it was visible as a darkness against the stars, and its massive wings spread wide enough to eclipse moons, and violet fire dripped from its jaws like liquid death. Then Sirith herself appeared on all human communication channels, and her voice carried strange harmonics that made electronics scream and people feel sick, and she spoke in a language that was ancient and beautiful and terrifying all at once. The translation computers struggled to convert her words, and when they finally did, everyone wished they had not heard, because Sirith said that humanity had stolen what was sealed for everyone's protection, and she demanded that humans return the prison and abandon these worlds. She said if humanity refused, then she would personally make sure that no memory of their species survived beyond the death of stars, and her voice was cold and final, like a judge pronouncing sentence. Lisa looked at her crew and saw the same question in every face, and they were wondering what prison Sirith was talking about and what terrible thing was inside it that an immortal elf woman was willing to commit genocide to protect. Helen's voice came over the communication system, and she sounded breathless with discovery and fear mixed together, and she said she had found something in the Antarctic ice and Lisa needed to come see it immediately. But there was no time, because Sirith's fleet was already moving toward Earth, and the human defense ships were moving to intercept, and in minutes the battle would begin, and humanity would learn if courage alone could stand against ancient power. Kate looked at her sensors and reported that the elf ships were not attacking yet, but forming a perimeter around Earth like they were preparing for a siege. And Sirith's dragon circled high above the fleet, watching everything with those burning intelligent eyes. Lisa made a decision and told Helen to send all her data to the command center, and whatever was hidden in Antarctica would. The Defiant Dawn hung in high orbit above Earth, and it was humanity's largest warship with 8,000 crew members aboard, and Captain Amy Holland stood on the bridge watching the tactical displays with growing dread because Sarieth's fleet was 3 times larger than anything intelligence had predicted. Lieutenant Kate Morgan checked her console and reported that contact with the enemy would happen in 6 hours, and the dimensional readings matched all previous attacks, which meant Sarieth was not trying to hide her approach, and she wanted humanity to know she was coming with overwhelming force. 6 hours to prepare for a battle that would decide if humans continued to exist, and Amy looked around the bridge, seeing young faces trying to stay calm, and she knew most of them would not survive the day, but none of them had asked to be transferred to safer posts. Dr. Helen Price had been given emergency authorization to investigate ancient sites on Earth, and her team was racing against time to understand what Sarieth wanted so desperately, and they had excavated 3 locations in the past week, finding chambers that were millions of years old. The architecture was clearly elvish, with flowing lines and strange symbols carved into every surface, and Helen recognized the dimensional mathematics from her studies, but seeing it here on Earth was disturbing because it meant elves had been on this planet long before humans evolved. Then Helen's team found something beneath the Antarctic ice in a chamber so deep it should not exist, and when they broke through the final seal, Helen stood frozen, staring at what they had discovered. It was a prison, and she knew this immediately from the symbols covering its crystalline surface, and the symbols told a story of binding and sealing and keeping something powerful locked away forever, and the crystal pulsed with inner darkness that made everyone uncomfortable. Contacted the command center and told them what she found, and Colonel Beth Martinez, who was head of planetary defense, said they should destroy it immediately, because if that was what Sarieth wanted, then humanity should deny her. But Kate had a different idea, and her voice was quiet when she suggested that maybe humanity should use whatever was inside, because the elves had feared it enough to abandon entire worlds, and perhaps humans should be less afraid of the prisoner than if Sarieth. Debate went on for 3 precious hours, while Sarieth's fleet moved closer, and military commanders argued with scientists and politicians about whether opening an ancient prison was worth the risk. Amy finally made the decision and ordered Dr. Price to begin extraction protocols, because humanity could not win a conventional battle against Sarieth, and if the prison contained a weapon, then they would use it, and if it contained a monster, then they would point it at their enemy. Helen's team worked carefully to move the crystalline prison because they did not want to accidentally break it open before they were ready, and they loaded it onto transport ships that flew up to the Defiant Dawn under heavy guard. Meanwhile, at the edge of the solar system, the first dimensional rifts began appearing, and they were early, which meant Sarieth had run out of patience, and the dragon emerged first as a hole in space that hurt to look at directly. Then came the elf fleet, with thousands of ships moving in perfect formation, and each ship glowed with internal magic that made human sensors go crazy trying to track them. Finally, Sarieth herself appeared, and this time she did not speak through communication channels, but manifested as a giant hologram above Earth, so large that people on the surface could see her in the sky, and her beauty was terrible and cold. She spoke, and her words echoed across the planet. And she said that humans had taken what was sealed for their protection, and she was giving humanity one final chance to return the prison and leave these worlds forever. She said that if humans refused, she would ensure that nothing of their civilization survived, and that future species would never know humans had existed at all. And her voice carried the weight of truth, because everyone listening knew she had the power to do exactly what she promised. May opened channels to respond, but before she could speak, Sarieth's dragon roared, and the sound carried across space somehow, and it was a challenge and a promise of violence. And 3 human defense ships that were advancing to aggressively simply exploded into fire. The message was clear, and Sarieth was done negotiating, and now there would only be battle. Helen's team had just finished securing the prison in the Defiant Dawn's cargo bay when the attack began, and the elf fleet surged forward with impossible speed, and human ships opened fire, but their weapons seemed to do very little damage. Sarieth's forces used magic in combat, and it was not like anything humanity had prepared for, because elf ships could teleport short distances and phase through solid matter, and their weapons bypassed shields as if they were not there. Dragon was the worst because it moved through the battlefield like a nightmare, and its violet flames consumed everything they touched, and ships did not just burn but dissolved, as if reality rejected their existence. Captain Amy watched from the bridge as the human fleet fought with desperate courage, and she saw the righteous Fury take 3 elf ships with it when its reactor overloaded. But she also saw the New Hope get torn apart by the Dragon's Claws. Kate worked her tactical station trying to find patterns in the elf attack formations, but it was like trying to predict water because they flowed around human defenses and struck where they were weakest. Colonel Martinez commanded the defense platforms orbiting Earth, and her weapons fired constantly at approaching elf ships, but for every one they destroyed, 2 more took its place down in the cargo bay. Helen stood before the crystalline prison, watching it pulse with increasing frequency, and the closer they brought it to Sarieth, the more active it became, and the symbols of binding were starting to show. Sami's voice came over the intercom, telling Helen that they had lost 2 more ships and were down to 11 vessels in the defense fleet, and whatever Helen was going to do, she needed to do it now. Helen's hand shook as she reached for the control panel. Her team had built to interface with the prison, and she knew this was probably a terrible mistake, but humanity was out of options. She looked at her assistant, Lisa Chen, and said that they should understand what they were about to release, because the Elvish record suggested it was something the elves could not kill, and only contain. Lisa Chen nodded and said she understood, but asked what choice did they have, and Helen agreed they had no choice at all. Helen deactivated the binding protocols, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the prison shattered and crystal fragments exploded into mist that vanished into nothing. From inside the broken prison emerged a figure that made reality self seem to recoil, and she was female in shape, but wrong somehow, because her features were too perfect and too symmetrical, like she had been designed rather than born. Her skin was pure darkness, and not black like color, but darkness like the absence of all light, and her eyes burned with colors that should not exist in normal space. She wore nothing but did not need clothes, because living shadows covered her body, and the shadows moved with their own intelligence and seemed hungry. The being looked around the cargo bay with curiosity, and then she spoke, and her voice resonated through dimensions and made everyone's teeth ache. She said that 10,000 years had passed since she was imprisoned. In 10,000 years, she had waited in silence, and now insects had freed her. And how disappointing then. She felt Sarieth's presence outside the ship, and her expression changed to something between joy and rage, and she said that her jailer had come, and how perfect this was. Being vanished and outside the ship, Sarieth's confident assault suddenly faltered because she felt what humanity had released, and for the first time, the elf-woman's composure, Krakatsary's voice, rang across all channels, and it was no longer cold but desperate, and she screamed that humans were fools, who had doomed everyone because the Darkened One had been imprisoned for genocide. She said the prisoner was her sister, who had consumed entire dimensions and would not stop with destroying Sarieth, but would devour everything that existed. The Darkened One appeared in space between the 2 fleets, and she floated there serene and terrible, and she looked at Sarieth and smiled with too many teeth. She said hello to her sister and asked if Sarieth was still playing warrior and still pretending her power meant anything, and then she gestured casually, and 3 elf ships ceased to exist. Complete Eliza as dragon roared in fury and charged at the Darkened One with violet flames coating its body, but the ancient being caught the dragon by its throat with one hand. The dragon was massive, but she held it like it weighed nothing, and her fingers sank into scales that had resisted nuclear weapons, and the dragon thrashed desperately, trying to break free. Then the dragon's roars turned to screams as it began to dissolve, and its essence was being pulled into the living darkness, and everyone watching felt horror at seeing something so powerful being consumed like food. Sarieth screamed, and the sound carried actual pain, and she had never shown emotion before, but now her voice broke as her companion of thousands of years was eaten. A leaf, she raised her hands and unleashed magic that had destroyed civilizations and reality. Itself warped under the force of her attack, but when it hit the Darkened One, nothing happened. The ancient being laughed and said she remembered why she loved. The battle for Earth was going exactly as badly as everyone had feared, and human ships fought with suicidal bravery, but it made no difference because Sarieth's dragon alone had destroyed 2 cruisers before being consumed by the darkened one. Sarieth herself stood on the hull of her flagship in the vacuum of space without any protection, and she directed her forces with gestures. All stars seemed to dim in her presence, but now she was wounded and bleeding from injuries that should not have been possible for someone of her power. The darkened one moved through space like a predator who had finally found her prey after a very long hunt, and she was not in a hurry. Because she had waited 10,000 years and a few more hours meant nothing. To her she gestured casually at a human destroyer, and the ship folded in on itself and vanished in 500. Crew members died without even understanding what killed them, and the ancient being smiled as if she had swatted a fly captain Amy. Holland watched from the defiant Dawn's bridge and felt helpless, because every weapon humanity had was useless against this creature, and conventional tactics meant nothing when your enemy could erase things from existence. Lieutenant Kate Morgan tried desperately to find some weakness in the darkened one's movements, but the being did not follow physical laws and appeared and disappeared at will, and her body seemed to exist in multiple dimensions. Simultaneously, Dr. Helen Price stood in the cargo bay surrounded by the remains of the shattered prison, and she was reading the symbols on the fragments frantically because somewhere in this ancient writing there had to be information about how the elves imprisoned this monster. The first time the darkened one spoke, and her voice reached every ship in both fleets, and she said she should thank the insects for freeing her, because Sarieth had always been too sentimental and could have destroyed humanity quickly, but instead tried to minimize casualties. She said Sarieth had spent weeks searching for the prison, carefully avoiding civilian areas, when she could have just burned entire worlds, but such weakness was pathetic, and the darkened one had no such limitations. As if to prove her point, she reached out toward Earth, and a section of the atmosphere simply vanished, and tens of thousands of people in that region died instantly from exposure to vacuum before emergency systems could activate. Eth saw this, and something broke inside her, because she had spent millennia protecting younger species from exactly this kind of senseless destruction, and now it was happening because humans had freed her sister in desperation. She looked at the human fleet and really saw them for the first time as more than primitive obstacles, and she saw their courage and their determination and their willingness to die protecting their home, and she understood them. Sarieth broadcast on human channels, and her voice was different now, without the cold arrogance, and she said that humans were primitive and foolish and reckless, but they had freed the darkened one from desperation, not malice. She said she understood desperation because she had spent millennia trying to protect younger races from her sister's hunger, and never imagined that one of those races would undo all her work trying to defend themselves. Amy made a decision that, hours ago, would have seemed insane, and she opened a direct channel to Sarieth and said that humanity could provide transport to the prison's original location, and Dr. Price had found binding protocols they had not tried yet. She said that if they worked together, maybe they could stop the darkened one, and Sarieth's laugh was bitter and painful, and she asked if Amy really thought they could contain her sister. Sarieth said it had taken the combined power of 12 dimensions to imprison the darkened one the first time, and most of those dimensions no longer existed because the darkened one had consumed them before being sealed. Awashi watched as her sister casually unraveled another section of space and erased a moon from existence, just to demonstrate her power, and Sarieth said they had no other options, so she would accept humanity's alliance. The darkened one noticed their regrouping, and her smile grew wider, and she said how sweet it was that Prey had decided to band together, and she asked Sarieth if she had fallen so far that she now needed humans to fight beside her. Sarieth materialized on the defiant Dawn's bridge, and her presence made the air shimmer, and electronics sparked, and she said she had learned something her sister never could, which was that strength shared was greater than strength hoarded. She said these humans, despite being primitive, had more courage than the darkened one had ever possessed, because real power was not about destruction, but about sacrifice for others. The Darkened One's eyes narrowed, and she said her sister wanted to see true power, and then she would demonstrate what real strength looked like. What happened next was a nightmare given physical form, and the Darkened One began to expand, and her body became a cloud of consuming shadow that spread through space like a disease. Everything the shadow touched was absorbed and unmade and fed into her endless hunger, and ships tried to flee, but she was faster, and planets attempted evacuation. But she was patient. She had waited 10,000 years in silence, and she could wait a few more days to devour everything in this dimension, and then she would move to the next dimension, and the next, until nothing remained. But her human ships retreated toward Earth, trying to form a defensive line, but the shadow kept spreading, and it moved through space like ink poured into water, and wherever it went, stars began to flicker and die. Kate worked frantically at her tactical station, and she told Captain Amy that the binding protocols required a dimensional anchor and something stable enough to hold the spell in place. Helen's voice came over the communication system, and she said the original prison used a collapsed star's core as an anchor, but the nearest one was light years away, and they could not reach it in time. Amy demanded to know if there were alternative anchors, and Helen's voice shook when she answered and said, theoretically, a living being of sufficient power could serve as anchor, but she said the being would have to maintain consciousness throughout the binding and hold the spell stable, while reality itself tried to tear them apart, and the pain would be unimaginable. Helen said the anchor would be trapped in that state until they died, and it would take centuries to die while locked in eternal agony. As the prison's foundation, Sereth appeared beside them on the bridge, and everyone jumped because they had not seen her move, and she looked at the spreading shadow consuming her fleet and her people and entire sectors of space. She said that yes, she could serve as anchor, and she had sufficient power to maintain the binding for centuries, and Kate protested, saying there had to be another way. Sereth said there was always another way, and it was called extinction, and she had run from this choice for 10,000 years, and fought against this inevitability across dimensions. She said perhaps it was fitting that she would end where humanity began, which was in sacrifice for those who come after, and her voice carried a sadness that was older than human civilization. Met Sareth's ancient eyes and asked what would happen to the elf people if they did this. And Sareth said they would survive and leave human space, and remember that a primitive species in their dying enemy gave them a future. She said it was more than her sister would have given them, and her smile was sad but genuine. The Darkened One's voice boomed across space, and she asked Sereth if she really thought she could cage her twice, and said she was beyond such tricks. Nazareth gathered her remaining power, and the air around her began to glow, and she replied that perhaps she could not cage her sister, but with these humans' help she would happily spend eternity finding out the ancient being rushed forward, and her shadow condensed back into humanoid form, because rage had overtaken cunning, and she screamed at Sereth, asking how dare she ally with insect. Sereth raised her hands and began weaving magic that made reality scream, and she told her sister that she had learned the value of allies, while the Darkened One had learned only hunger and isolation. The two sisters clashed in the void between fleets, and their combat was beyond anything humans could fully comprehend, because they fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Every blow Sereth landed created ripples in space that capsized nearby ships, and every attack from the Darkened One left wounds in reality itself that would take decades to heal. Human crew members watched in awe and terror as beings older than their sun fought with power that made nuclear weapons look like candles. And Kate recorded everything, knowing that if they survived, this would be the most important data in human history. Helen worked with her team to prepare the binding ritual, and they needed to recreate the spell that had imprisoned the Darkened One before, but with only a fraction of the original power. She carved symbols into the Defiant Dawn's cargo bay, and the mathematics hurt to look at because they described dimensions humanity had not discovered yet, and forces that should not exist in normal space. Sereth was losing, and everyone could see it because she had already been wounded fighting humanity, and her dragon was gone, and the Darkened One was fresh and filled with 10,000 years of rage. The ancient being caught Sereth by the throat and lifted her. This was how it should have ended. Millennia ago, with her sister broken and helpless Arieth, smiled through the pain and said that her sister was right, and this was how it should end, but not how the Darkened One expected. The Darkened One held Serieth by the throat and squeezed slowly because she wanted her sister to suffer, and everyone watching knew. This was not just about power, but about pain that had festered for 10,000 years in isolation. Serieth's face showed agony, but also something else, and it was determination, mixed with sadness, and she whispered something only her sister could hear, and the Darkened One's expression changed from triumph to confusion. Captain Amy saw Serieth's signal and understood what was about to happen, and she opened fleet-wide communications and told every ship to prepare for her command and not to question. What came next, the Darkened One was so focused on her sister that she did not notice the human fleet repositioning. And she did not see Dr. Helen Price activate the binding ritual in the cargo bay. Serieth suddenly released a pulse of pure energy that sent her sister flying backward, and the ancient being tumbled through space, surprised for the first time in the battle. Lieutenant Kate Morgan watched her tactical display and saw that Serieth's energy pulse had driven the Darkened One into the exact position they needed, and she told Amy they had one chance at this. Helen's voice came over the intercom, and she said the ritual was ready, but they needed time, and someone had to keep the Darkened One in position for at least 3 minutes. 3 minutes might not sound like a long time, but in combat against a being who could erase things from existence, it was an eternity, and everyone knew whoever volunteered would not serve. Serieth materialized on the Defiant Dawn's bridge again, and she was bleeding from wounds that glowed with unnatural light, and she said she would keep her sister occupied. But the humans had to promise her something. Amy asked what she wanted, and Serieth said when this was over, the humans must remember that her people were not all like the Darkened One, and most elves just wanted peace, and to live without the shadow of ancient crimes. She said, promise that humanity would not hate all elves for what happened here. And Amy gave her word and said humanity understood the difference between one monster and an entire species. Serieth nodded and vanished and reappeared in front of her sister, who was recovering from being thrown, and the Darkened One looked at Serieth with new respect. Ancient beings said that her sister still had some fight left, and perhaps this would be entertaining after all, and Serieth replied that she had always underestimated those who fought for others instead of themselves. They clashed again, and this time Serieth was not trying to win, but only to survive and keep her sister's attention, and she dodged and weaved and blocked while Helen's team prepared the binding. The Darkened One grew frustrated because Serieth kept slipping away and refusing to engage directly, and she realized something was wrong and started to pull back, but Serieth grabbed her sister's arm and held on with desperate strength, and she said that if she was going to become a prison, then her sister was going to be the prisoner. The Darkened One's eyes widened as she felt the binding ritual activate, and dimensional mathematics wrapped around her like chains, and she screamed in rage and tried to teleport away. Serieth, held tight in her body, began to glow as she channeled the ritual through herself, and she said that 10,000 years ago she had made a mistake by leaving her sister alone in darkness. She said this time she would stay, and they would spend eternity together, as they should have from the beginning, and the Darkened One's expression changed from rage to something like fear. The ancient being said no, and begged Serieth not to leave her alone again, and said she could not bear the silence, and the isolation was worse than any pain. Serieth's voice was gentle when she replied and said her sister would not be alone this time because Serieth would be there too, and perhaps, given another 10,000 years, they could remember what it meant to be family. Amy watched this and realized what was happening. It was not just a binding but a reconciliation, and these two ancient beings were solving a family tragedy in the worst possible way. Colonel Beth Martinez reported that the elf fleet was withdrawing and opening dimensional portals home, and they were leaving behind only a small group to witness. What came next? Kate asked if they should stop the elf ships from escaping, and Amy said no, because they were not enemies anymore, and they were victims of the same tragedy as humanity. The binding ritual reached its peak, and Dr. Helen We just stood in the cargo bay, watching as reality bent around the two sisters, and crystal began to form encasing them, Both the Darkened One fought against the binding, but her struggles grew weaker as the spell took hold, and poor Sereth poured all her remaining power into making sure the prison would be strong enough to last forever. Sereth looked toward Earth one final time, and her voice reached the defiant Dawn's Bridge. And she said she was sorry for the destruction she had caused, and hoped humanity would forgive her desperation on me. Said there was nothing to forgive because Sereth had been trying to protect everyone, and had paid the highest price possible in humanity. Would remember her sacrifice. The crystal grew rapidly, encasing both sisters in a prison that glowed with soft light, and inside the two beings held each other. And it was impossible to tell if they were fighting or embracing Helen. Reported that the binding was stabilizing and would hold for at least 10,000 years, and possibly forever, depending on how much power Sereth had left the crystal prison. Floated in space between Earth and the elf fleet, and both sides watched as it pulsed with inner light, and then slowly began to fade from view as it shifted into dimensional space. The remaining elf ships sent a message to humanity, and it was from their new commander, who said that Sereth had been their greatest leader, and humans had shown themselves worthy of respect. The message said the elf people would leave human space forever, and in return they asked that humanity guard the prison, and never attempt to open it. Agenimi replied that humanity accepted this responsibility and would protect the prison, as Sereth had protected the universe from her sister. The elf ships opened their final portals and vanished, and humanity was left alone with their damaged fleet and their scars and the knowledge of what almost happened. Kate checked her sensors and confirmed that the shadow was gone and the Darkened One's presence had vanished from their dimension, and Earth was safe for now, but the cost had been terrible, and Amy looked at the casualty reports and felt sick because 12,000 people had died and 41 ships were lost, and entire colonies still needed years to recover. Darhelen Price came to the bridge and said that the prison should be moved to a secure location, and she recommended returning it to Antarctica, where it had been hidden before. Amy agreed and ordered the prison transported to a new facility deep underground where it could be guarded by the best security humanity could provide over the next few weeks. Humanity began to rebuild and mourn their dead and try to understand what had happened, and scientists studied the elf technology left behind undestroyed. Shipskate analyzed all the recordings from the battle and wrote reports that would change human understanding of the universe and dimensional physics and the nature of power itself. Helen led teams to study the other ancient sites on human worlds, and they found more evidence of elf civilization that predated humanity, and slowly pieced together the tragic history of the two. Sister Sereth and the Darkened One had been born in a dimension of incredible beauty and magic. They were the daughters of ancient rulers who commanded reality itself, but the Darkened One grew obsessed with proving she was superior to all other beings, and started consuming other dimensions to demonstrate her power. Sereth opposed her sister, and a civil war erupted that destroyed their home dimension and killed billions and scattered their people across the multiverse. Finally, Sereth gathered allies from 12 dimensions and trapped her sister in the crystal prison and sealed it away on abandoned worlds, hoping time would heal the Darkened One's madness. But instead of healing, the isolation made things worse, and the Darkened One's hunger grew stronger and her rage deeper, until she was no longer the sister Sereth remembered when humans accidentally found the prison. Sereth had no choice but to try retrieving it before it was opened, but she tried to minimize casualties, because she still believed in protecting life. Amy read these reports and felt deep sadness for both sisters because they were victims of pride and misunderstanding, and neither one had wanted things to end this way. She visited the prison facility in Antarctica and stood before the crystal watching the two figures inside, and sometimes she thought she could see them moving. The guards reported that the prison occasionally pulsed with light and made sounds like distant music, or perhaps crying, and scientists said this was normal for dimensional bindings. Emmy wondered if the sisters were fighting or talking or just existing together in that space between dimensions, and she hoped they found some peace in their eternal imprisonment. One night, she stood alone before the prison and spoke quietly, saying that humanity would keep its promise and guard them forever, and thanked Sereth for her sacrifice. For just a moment, the crystal glowed brighter, and Amy could swear she saw Sereth smile before the light faded, and she was left alone with her thoughts in the cold Antarctic darkness. 3 months had passed since the battle, and Earth was still recovering, but life was slowly returning to normal, and Captain Amy Holland found herself visiting the memorial garden more often than she should. The garden was built on the grounds of the military headquarters and contained a wall with 12,000 names carved into black stone, and each name represented someone who died defending humanity from the ancient threat. Amy stood before the wall and traced her fingers over the names. And remembered faces of crew members she had commanded and friends she had lost, and each name carried a story of courage and sacrifice. Lieutenant Kate Morgan joined her and stood silently beside her for a while before speaking, and she said that Council had made a decision about the prison and wanted to know what Amy thought. Amy asked what they wanted to do, and Kate explained that some politicians thought humanity should study the prison and learn from the magic inside because it could advance human technology by centuries. Amy turned to look at Kate, and her expression was cold, and she asked if these politicians had forgotten what happened when humans interfered with the prison before. Kate said she had told them the same thing, but they argued that understanding elf magic could give humanity an advantage if there were future threats. Amy said there would be no study and no interference, and humanity had made a promise to Sereth, and they would keep it, and if the politicians disagreed, they could come talk to her. Personally, Kate smiled and said she had hoped Amy would say that, and she had already told the council no, but wanted to make sure. Amy agreed before making it official. R. Helen Price had written a comprehensive report about the battle and the prison and the history of the two sisters, and her report was classified at the highest level, but copies were stored in multiple secure locations. Helen believed that future generations needed to understand what happened and why humanity must never open the prison again, and her report included detailed warnings about the consequences of interfering with dimensional bindings. She also included personal observations about Sereth and the Darkened One, and how their tragedy demonstrated that even immortal beings with godlike power could be destroyed by pride and isolation. Helen wrote that the real lesson was not about magic or weapons, but it's about the importance of connection and communication, and how even the worst conflicts often started from misunderstandings that grew over time. The elf refugees who had stayed behind to witness the binding had eventually returned home, but they left behind a message crystal that contained their people's history and culture. The crystal was studied by human linguists and historians. What they learned changed humanity's understanding of the universe and its place in its place. Were not conquerors or invaders, but refugees themselves, in their home dimension had been destroyed by the civil war between the sisters, and they had scattered across multiple dimensions seeking new Homo. Sereth had taken responsibility for containing her sister and spent millennia hunting down and securing the various prisons she had created on abandoned worlds. She had been doing this alone for 10,000 years, and the weight of that responsibility had made her cold and distant, but underneath, she still cared about protecting life. Message crystal contained a formal apology from the elf people for the destruction caused during their attempts to retrieve the prison, and they promised never to return to human space without permission. It also contained information about dimensional travel and basic magic theory, and the elves said this was a gift to honor the alliance between Sereth and humanity. Human scientists studied the gift carefully and began to understand the principles behind dimensional rifts, and eventually humanity's first experimental dimensional drive was built. Kate led the project, and she named the prototype ship the Sereth's Promise, and when it made its first successful dimensional jump, the entire human civilization celebrated. The jump was only a few light years, but it proved that humans could learn elf technology and adapt it for their own purposes, and suddenly the galaxy became much smaller. But Amy insisted that the new drives include safeguards to prevent accidentally opening dimensional rifts near the prison, and Kate agreed, and built multiple redundant safety systems. Earth's government established a permanent guard around the Antarctic facility, and soldiers rotated through on 6-month assignments, and they took their duty seriously because they understood what they were protecting. The guards reported strange phenomena around the prison, and sometimes they heard music that seemed to come from nowhere, and sometimes they saw lights dancing in the ice. Scientists said these were just echoes from the dimensional binding, and nothing to worry about, but the guards were not so sure, and they treated the prison with respect. Bordering on reverent, Samiv visited the facility regularly, and she always spent a few minutes standing before the crystal, speaking quietly to Sarioth and thanking her for her sacrifice. She told Sarioth it's about humanity's progress and how the elf gift had opened new possibilities and how humans were learning to be better neighbors in the universe. She also told Sarioth about the memorial garden and how her name was carved there alongside the human dead because she had died defending Earth just as much as any human soldier one day. Amy brought flowers and placed them at the base of the crystal, and she said she knew Sarioth, probably could not hear her, but it felt important to keep talking anyway. The crystal pulsed with light, and Amy felt warmth spread through her chest, and she could have sworn she heard a voice whisper, "Thank you," but it might have been her imagination. Kate sometimes accompanied Amy on these visits, and she would bring her latest research data and explain to Sarioth how the dimensional drives worked and how humans were using elf knowledge. She said that humans were being careful not to repeat the mistakes. That led to the prison being opened, and every captain who commanded a dimensional ship was required to learn the history. Dr. Helen continued studying ancient sites, and she found more evidence of elf civilizations scattered across human space, and each discovery added to humanity's understanding of the sisters. She found art depicting the two sisters before the war, and they looked happy together, and the darkened one had not always been a monster, but had been corrupted slowly by pride and isolation. Helen published papers about the psychological effects of isolation on powerful beings and how the darkened one's imprisonment had made her worse instead of better. She argued that if Sarioth had stayed with her sister from the beginning, instead of leaving her alone, the tragedy might have been prevented. Damie read Helen's papers and thought about the two sisters locked together now for eternity, and wondered if they were finally healing, or if they were still fighting. The prison gave no clear answers, and the figures inside remained locked in their eternal embrace or struggle, and humanity could only watch and guard and hope. Years passed, and the memorial garden grew larger as names were added from other conflicts and new threats. But Sarioth's name remained at the center, carved in gold instead of black. Amai retired from active duty and became an advisor to the dimensional travel program, and she made sure every new captain understood the importance of the prison and its guardians. Kate took command of the Sariths, its promise, and led humanity's exploration of nearby dimensional spaces, and discovered 3 new habitable dimensions that humanity could expand in two-boat. She always returned to Earth and always visited the prison and always thanked Sarioth for making human expansion possible through her sacrifice. Helen became the director of the Antarctic facility and spent her final years studying the prison and writing extensively about dimensional theory and the nature of power. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 90, and her ashes were scattered near the prison at her request. Because she said she wanted to stay close to the sisters, Amy attended the funeral and stood before the crystal one last time, and she was old now and tired and ready to rest, but she wanted to keep her promise to Sarioth one final time. She said that humanity had grown and learned and expanded across dimensions, and they had never forgotten the sacrifice that she made it possible. She said the prison would be guarded forever, and humanity would never open it again, and future generations would remember Sarioth as the protector who gave everything to save those who came after. The crystal pulsed with light one final time, and Amy felt peace settle over her, and she knew somehow that Sarioth heard and understood and was content. On died 2 weeks later, surrounded by family, and her last words were about keeping promises and honoring those who sacrificed. For others, the memorial garden added her name to the wall and placed it next to Sarioth's, and visitors would often see flowers left at both names by people who remembered the battle centuries past, and humanity spread across dimensions and grew into a spacefaring civilization that rivaled the ancient elves in knowledge and power. But they never forgot the prison in Antarctica, and they never stopped guarding it, and every human child learned the story of Sarioth and her sister and the terrible price of pride. The dimensional drives that carried humanity to the stars were all named after fallen heroes, and the first and most important was always the Sarith's promise. And deep beneath the Antarctic ice, the crystal prison glowed softly with Two figures locked together in eternal companionship and perhaps in that space between dimensions. They had finally found peace.